Welcome. My name is Allison Lauer, Executive Director of the Florida Kiwanis Foundation. Today, we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the foundation, and we're delighted to do that by focusing on the Bleckman Fund for Early Childhood. In 2019, the foundation launched this fund to honor Will and Rachel Bleckman and their commitment to enhancing public knowledge about the crucial importance of early years of an individual's development. What better way to accomplish this than a webinar series devoted to this important subject and its ramifications? First, a word about Will and Rachel. Many of you have followed the Bleckman's lifetime of great service, and Kiwanians truly need no introduction to them. The Bleckmans have served our great state of Florida, our nation, and our overall international community for over 30 years with countless acts of leadership. Dr. Will served as president of Kiwanis International in 1990 through 1991, introducing the program Young Children Priority 1 and chairing the International Young Children Priority 1 Committee. Rachel was an active participant in Young Children Priority 1, organizing a partnership between Head Start and Reading is Fundamental, which the wives of Kiwanis governors participated. Some of these literacy programs have been in operation for more than 30 years. The Bleckmans' lifelong passion for education, advocacy, and research of childhood development has revolutionized the way Kiwanians view these early years. So without any further delay, I would like to turn over the program to Rachel Bleckman to begin today's webinar.
Good evening. Thank you, Allie. Will and I congratulate the Florida Kiwanis Foundation on its 50th anniversary, and we thank them for the honor and the opportunity to impact the lives of children. Welcome, everyone, to the first of our four-part series on early childhood. Today, we will focus on the significance of ages 0 to 5 in the development of the individual and the consequent impact on society. In the next 3 days, participants in this webinar will also have an opportunity to see the excellent film on early childhood called No Small Matter. Then webinar 2 will examine quality early childhood education. Webinar 3 will focus on policy and practice, and webinar 4 will focus on the Bleckman Fund, its future and its grants. Our thanks to the foundation and its executive director, Allison Lauer, for helping to arrange these sessions, and Rebecca Parlakian, Peter Gorski, Rachel Giannini, Phyllis Calefe, Mimi Grant, and Zachary Gibson, the professionals who will appear. We thank them for their time and expertise. Years ago, I won't tell you how many, when I was a college student learning about child development, the importance and ramification of a child's experience from 0 to 5 were already clear as a result of research. So it was so exciting when Will, in preparation for his year as Kiwanis International President, saw the significance of this, did his own research, and with a panel of Kiwanians presented Young Children Priority 1 to the International Board, which accepted it as its major emphasis program for the years 1991 to at least 1993. By then, brain research, new on the horizon, supported the earlier findings of the critical importance of 0 to 5, and threw light on the question of whether nature, genes, or nurture, experience, was more important. As we now know, it is the interaction of both that determines all that follows. Since that time, Will has been a tireless student of child development, an advocate for young children, and the author of many programs and articles on the subject. So I'm sorry to report that Will's recent illness prevents him from participating tonight. In his place, we're fortunate to be able to turn the program over to Rebecca Parlakian and Dr. Peter Gorski, two noted authorities in the field. Rebecca is 0 to 3 Senior Director of Programs and develops resources for parents alongside the training of parents and early childhood professionals. She's developed a variety of parenting resources in various formats. She's also co-authored 3 parenting education curricula and published articles on topics ranging from dual language development for the impact of screens on very young children. Rebecca holds a master's degree in education and human development with a concentration in infant-toddler special education from George Washington University, where she's currently serving on the adjunct faculty. Dr. Peter Gorski is the author of many articles on pediatrics and recently 2 collections of essays and poems. He's a professor of pediatrics and humanities, health and society at Florida International University. He is also a professor of public health, pediatrics, and psychiatry at the University of South Florida and professor of public health at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine. He's a past president of the Florida Association for Infant Mental Health and also served as community health, child development, innovation officer at the Children's Trust of Miami-Dade County. He was the director of research and innovation at the Children's Board of Hillsborough County in Tampa, and was also the director of the Lawton and Rita Childs Center for Healthy Mothers and Babies at USF. Please put your questions and comments for Ms. Parlakian and Dr. Gorski in the chat at the bottom of your screen. And after their presentations, I will use as many of them as I possibly can in the time remaining. Now it's my pleasure to turn this over to Rebecca to get us started. Rebecca?
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen for the presentation. I am so pleased and honored to be with you all here today. And I'm also incredibly proud to work at 0 to 3. So I want to take just a moment to introduce our organization. We are the nation's leading nonprofit organization committed to ensuring that all babies and toddlers have a strong start in life. The first 3 years of a baby's life are so deeply important, and they lay the foundation for lifelong health and well-being. And for the past 4 decades, 0 to 3 has been on the front lines to encourage strong early connections for all infants, toddlers, and their big people, parents, grandparents, care providers, and early educators. So let's start at the beginning, the newborn period, newborn to 6 months. When we're born, you can see we have billions of neurons, but they're not, for the most part, connected very efficiently yet. In the first 3 years of life, a child's brain will form neural connections at the rate of about 1 million new connections every second. And this slide shows how brain connections are growing across the first 6 months. The rate and acceleration of brain development in this period is unmatched at any other point in life. Look at the brain of a newborn. These lines indicate that neurological connections are happening even from birth, which is why the quality of care a baby receives starting from day 1 makes a difference. If you look further, you'll see these synaptic connections have doubled by 1 month and almost tripled by 3 months of age. And the connections become even denser by 6 months of age. In the months that follow the formation of these connections, something very interesting starts to happen. It's a process called synaptic pruning. And this is where babies' brains actually prune away or eliminate connections that go unused. Now, while this sounds very dire, it's actually an important and adaptive process that allows our brains to function efficiently and quickly. The connections in a child's brain that are strengthened and sustained are those that are repeated through life experiences. And they help babies learn the essentials they need to survive and thrive within their family, community, and culture. Ultimately, it's the quality of a baby's relationships with parents, grandparents, and all the other caregiving adults in their lives that influence which connections are being made and which are sustained over time. So what does this all mean? It means that for babies, Early human connections shape early brain connections. Now, when we think about the connections that babies make early in life, many of them are positive and nurturing. But babies and toddlers also experience stress. Now, we have a continuum of stress here, and I'm going to touch on each kind of stress. But it's important to ground ourselves in remembering that not all stress is bad. Experiencing positive or normative stress actually gives us coping skills. It helps us develop resilience and persistence in the face of obstacles. So, what's stressful for a baby? Well, think about a baby who has to wait a few minutes while a bottle is prepared, or having to separate from a parent at bedtime, or having to wiggle their bodies toward an out of reach toy. Those are all examples of positive stress. For a toddler, imagine having to share your favorite train with your cousin, or wait for your mom or dad to finish diapering your younger sibling. For older kids, think about things like taking tests, trying out for the school play, trying out for a sports team, applying for a job, applying for college, getting up the courage to ask someone out on a date. This is all positive stress. What helps us when we go through positive stress is access to a loving, supportive relationship where we can seek comfort and soothing when we get overwhelmed, and when we can see positive coping strategies modeled or suggested to us. That relationship becomes absolutely critical when we move into tolerable stress. Tolerable stress are intense, difficult, or frightening experiences that a child might go through. Think about going through a hurricane, a house fire, parental separation or divorce, the loss of a grandparent or parent, parental deployment. These are all really intense experiences that could have lasting negative impacts on a child. But the presence of that relationship, a relationship where a child can be buffered from the worst of the stress, where they can seek comfort, where they have access to coping strategies, that relationship is exactly what makes the stress tolerable and allows children to return to a healthy trajectory. Unfortunately, that relationship is not present when we move into toxic stress. The lack of a supportive and loving relationship is exactly what makes toxic stress so toxic. These are situations where a child is experiencing an overwhelming, frightening, threatening, or violent event, and they have no supportive and nurturing adult relationship to turn to. The most potent form of toxic stress is child abuse and neglect, which is truly a violation of the parent-child relationship. In this situation, the very person the child would turn to for soothing, for comfort, is also the same person who's the source of their terror. And that is an impossible scenario for a young child to make sense of, and frankly, for an adult as well. So, without support and intervention for children who have had adverse experiences, the risk is that those vulnerabilities affect them for life. And this is the logic model that we use to think about how that happens. Children who experience repeated abuse and neglect develop something called complex trauma, which means that the brain, over a period of time, months, years, the brains are flooded with a stress hormone called cortisol. The skyrocketing high levels of cortisol in the brain begin to impact the architecture of the brain. They actually influence how the brain is shaped and what connections are sustained, which ultimately can disrupt children's emotional, cognitive, and physical development over the long term. Our work at 0 to 3 is entirely about breaking this cycle. A leading study examined the relationship between early adverse experiences like those on the screen, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, neglect, exposure to domestic violence, or substance abuse or mental illness, parental separation or divorce, or the incarceration of a close family member. So they looked at the relationship between early adverse experiences, how many of these experiences someone reported having before the age of 18, and then compared them to the adult's current health status and well-being. And what they found was staggering. They discovered that early risk is cumulative, meaning that the more early adversity a person experiences increases their risk for poor health and well-being in adulthood, such as increasing the risk for alcohol and substance abuse, depression and attempted suicide, cardiovascular disease, and even the risk of early death. There's so much to consider here. It's a very intense slide, but I do think it's important to recognize two important costs here. First, the material cost to society of remediation of trauma, whether it's through the school systems, school services, homeless services, substance use dependency services, or even law enforcement services. But the other more important cost is simply the human cost of lives lost, of lives unfulfilled, and the grief of those left behind. But I don't want to leave us on a sad note, because the truth is that our brains are pretty amazing and incredibly adaptive. Our brains are experience dependent, meaning that based on our life experiences, even in the early days and months of life, our brain responds to the inputs we have from our lives, which means that the brain can wire itself to reflect the experience of threat and trauma. But when exposed to experiences of safety, security, and nurturance, the brain can rewire itself and begin to return to a healthier trajectory. Parents and primary caregivers are a huge part of this healing, which is why we feel so passionately at 0 to 3 about providing parents and families with support as well. Adults who receive the support they need are better positioned to provide young children with the support to cope in the face of stress and trauma. This is why it is so important to partner with parents. Parents are a child's first and most fundamental relationship. And the truth is that we are all strongly influenced in our parenting decisions by our experience of being children. And 0 to 3 has established that over and over in our parent surveys across the US. But what we like to remind parents is that parenting is powerful because you get to choose which parenting strategies and traditions from your own childhood that you pull forward into your family and which you choose to leave behind. To that end, 0 to 3, in partnership with a work group of board members and 0 to 3 fellows, reflected on this question: what elements of parenting, supported by research, promote strong parent-child relationships and nurture a child's capacity to love, trust, explore, and learn? And the result was our definition of positive parenting, which highlights 9 key research-based parenting practices. I think Allie shared this link with the group if you want to look at all 9, but we're going to be focusing in on 3 practices today. So one practice I'm going to start with is the simple or not so simple at times act of parents responding sensitively to children's cues. This means that if we see our baby, chewing on their finger, we say to ourselves, are you feeling hungry? So we're noticing their behaviors, their facial expressions, their body movements, the sounds they're making. And we're trying to interpret the meaning of those cues and respond in a timely and sensitive way. Even if our responses are not always right, and they're not always right, the act of working to interpret a child's message and responding in kind teaches children that their efforts to communicate are important and respected. They learn to trust that their needs, physical and emotional, will be understood and met. And the foundation for communication skills are laid through these back and forth interactions. What about when we get it wrong? Well, it happens all the time. Our baby's crying, we think they're hungry, but it turns out they want to roll around on the floor for a little while and play. These mismatches are frequent and common. But what's most important is the repair and reconnection that happens between parent and child. Babies and toddlers learn that their parents and their adults will stick with them, even when the going gets rough. The research bears out the importance of noticing and responding to our children's cues. Both parental responsiveness and parental sensitivity are associated with a strong, loving, trusting parent-child relationship with enhanced social skills, fewer behavior problems, improved verbal ability, and overall intellectual achievement. The research has also found that the more responsive parents are to babies' cries early on, the less babies cry at the end of the first year, which goes to show that you just can't spoil a baby. Next, we're going to look at the positive parenting practice of imagining our child's point of view. I'm the first one to say that that is not always easy, especially when your child is rolling on the floor of aisle 8 because you won't get them Oreos that day. But the ability of an adult to treat a baby or toddler as an individual with a mind, with their own experiences and their own feelings, someone who's capable of goals and motivations and intentional behaviors. The adult's ability to do that and to assume best intent really bears out incredibly positive outcomes for children. It contributes again to a positive, trusting relationship between parent and child. It also is associated with enhanced language skills and play skills. And interestingly, it's also associated with a child's ability at age 4 to understand or imagine other people's thoughts and feelings. We call this empathy. And what it tells us is that when we can show our children empathy, they more easily offer it to others. And the third positive parenting practice that I'm going to focus on is something that seems very straightforward. We might actually forget how profound it is, and that is the showing delight in moments of connection with our child. Delight is one of the most powerful tools a parent can use to support the healthy development of their child. This means that we're telegraphing to our children how loved and special they are, and that we share in our child's joy and curiosity. This shared pleasure is simply how much parents and children seem to enjoy one another. And of course, not every moment of parenting is characterized by shared pleasure. I remember one particular week in my household where every member of my family came down with the same stomach flu every 36 hours for a week. There was not much pleasure that week, but we know that children are profoundly shaped by the messages we send them about themselves. Are they fun to be with? Smart, caring, creative, capable? Are they worthy of love, respect, and attention? The power of parenting is that we tell babies and toddlers who they are, and that is who they become. Another way to think about shared pleasure is something called synchrony. And synchrony is that dance between parent and child when we have these short, playful interactions with our little one. These brief moments of connection are just sources of pleasure and joy for both parent and child. The research has shown that more shared pleasure, more parent-child synchrony is associated with positive child cognitive or thinking skills, as well as positive behavioral outcomes and a lower risk of behavioral problems. And remember, human development is forgiving. Not every moment needs to be a perfect snapshot of synchrony. In fact, the research shows that Occasional breaks or mismatches are helpful. They're a form of positive stress that can actually enrich a child's communication skills and creativity. If there's one thing that I hope you remember from our discussion today, I hope it's this. Babies depend on their big people, which means that parents matter a lot. The seminal child development researcher Yuri Bronfenbrenner put it like this: somebody's got to be crazy about that kid. That's number one. First, last, and always. So I'll leave you with that and pause now. I am so very honored to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Peter Gorski. Peter, would you like to take it away?
Yes, Rebecca, thank you. And I so enjoyed your excellent and really important presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I will begin. Thank you all for sharing part of your early evening after a long day with us on this really important and very exciting subject to which I have dedicated my entire professional life, that is infant and early childhood development. And so in the next few minutes, I'm going to tell you everything I've learned. Just to assure you, I have my running shoes on, and I hope you're in the mood for a race. So here we go. You know, a little less elegantly than Rebecca showed, this depicts what Mother Nature works on during the course of pregnancy and the first years of life. So in fact, you can see that the infant, the baby, is born after so much of nature's energy has been devoted to brain development, disproportionately to the rest of our body health and growth. By the time, of course, we reach adulthood, it's our midsection that's more likely to grow than our brains and heads. But because the brain and head of the infant is so large and therefore important, it is there to receive and send messages from the world and to begin to understand, hear, listen to, communicate with the outside world, and therefore begin to learn how valued I am as a child, how much I am connected to others, and in fact, how much I can achieve on my own and with the help of others. So speaking of that, if I can advance my slides, let's see if I can do that. Yes. So really what I want to show you is that child development is more complicated than the question we have always debated over the ages. How much of our development is thanks to genetics or nature, and how much is due to lived experience, relationships that we have in life? Well, I'm going to expand beyond that to let you know that the two are really inseparable, joined, and influence one another. That is to say, life experience for each child is embedded into his or her developing biology, affecting the action of their genes, their behavior, even what traits they pass on to the next generations. In fact, early experience sets the course for later health, behavior, and development. But you know, it's really not any one individual support or adverse experience that determines how we develop, but it is the balance, so that those who are most fortunate have positive experiences overwhelming the negative ones, and those who are less fortunate and have violations of their trust and caring develop, unfortunately, less well with respect to their behavior and even their biological health. Well, as Rebecca stated, the first and most important of all of what babies learn from life comes through their relationship with their parents. And so if we are to be concerned with the optimal growth and health and development of young children, we have to likewise concern ourselves with the health and well-being of their parents. In fact, one outstanding historic pediatrician and psychoanalyst, Dr. Donald Winnicott, once said, "There is no such thing as a baby. There is only a baby in relationship to a parent." In his day and age, he said to a mother, but now we're much more understanding. So one other thing to broaden our discussion. How can we care about the welfare, the well-being of parents, unless we also know the extent to which the communities in which they live support their health, their mental and physical health? Everything from the availability of childcare to the excellence of education and their economic wherewithals, the safety of their neighborhoods, the friendliness of their neighbors and neighborhoods, the health of their environment, the air, water, soil, and food, and the amount of personal dignity they are permitted. Rebecca mentioned the 3 levels of stress, and the fact that I will hammer in again is that some stress is not only inevitable, but vital for us to learn that we can overcome challenge and master difficult situations like bad health, parent separation from parents, test taking, etc., and get even more ready and expectant for the challenges that lie ahead. When it comes to that stress, however, that is toxic, just look at this graphic example that is from a sophisticated form of X-ray that measures the activity of different areas of the brain. The brain, these are 2 children's brains. The brain on the left is that of a child who is fortunate to be enmeshed in a loving family, who attend to the child with protection, sensitivity, direction, and love. The child on the right, from a Romanian orphanage, unfortunately was extremely deprived during infancy of the same sources of affection, attention, responsivity, and support. And look, that actually ate away at the brain matter itself. Rebecca told you about that landmark first study of the effect of adverse experiences during childhood on health and behavior decades later in adulthood, that concentrated primarily on the forms of abuse and neglect and violence and mental illness, parental separation, or even the incarceration of a parent. We've learned since that initial study done 25 years ago in Southern California of so many more sources of childhood stress that when disproportionately weighing without the balance of supportive relationships from family and neighborhood can cause real adversity and even physical damage to the child's health and behavior. Things like poverty, like violence in the community, prolonged separation, victimization or bullying, school stress, natural disasters, environmental injustice. Some people simply don't live in areas that are safe. Discrimination by race, by nationality, by ability and disability, by sexual preference. Acute events that are sustained over time, the loss of a parent, the loss of a job, the loss of a community, and the impact, sometimes negative, of media and technology on the lives of children today. The only thing I want to add to what Rebecca told you about the ACE study, or Adverse Childhood Experience, is that the subjects of the study were middle-class, white, college-educated adults who were recollecting their experience of childhood some 40 or 50 years before. And yet, this privileged group of people had more than the majority of them had at least one of these adverse childhood events. Almost half had more than one of these adverse events, and it was the people who had 4 or more of these so-called ACEs, or adverse events, during childhood, that had, as adults, they suffered mental and physical health disorders. Well, how early does this sort of stress affect our life course? Very early, it turns out, in the first years of life. Here's an example of many of a study that showed even at the beginning of school, this is for kindergarten, you can see that children perform less well and more well depending on the benefits of their family in any of several dimensions. This graph shows family income and kindergarten test scores. This graph shows that parents who are more educated, more verbal, use more words when they speak with or ask questions of their young children. And already by age 3, children of less fortunate, less advantaged parents and families have vocabularies that are only half as rich as those of children the same age, but whose parents are much more literate. This is a composite graph of what I think is perhaps the most powerful of all studies, called Project STAR, that was conducted in Tennessee, of all the school children in Tennessee and their early childhood experiences and kindergarten test scores. It was originally designed to examine what's the impact of class size on student school performance. But the real surprise was that it discovered, by following children for the next 25 years, that almost every outcome of childhood, whether it's college attended, whether it's income earned as a young adult, whether it's mobility, anything that you could imagine matters, was predicted from the performance in the first years of school. And very little mattered after that to change the course or direction of the child's progress. Again, to remind you that there are lots of sources of support, just as there are of stress. And it's that balance that determines the trajectory for each child being positive or negative. Poverty is, in fact, sickening or destructive to our health. We know that there's a direct correlation between a child's health and an adult's health, between a child's wealth and the wealth of that child in adulthood. But we also have learned that there's a direct correlation between the wealth of the child's family and the child's health as an adult. Regardless of the health condition during childhood or the change in social economic condition from childhood to adulthood, you're pretty much stuck with the big important influences you experienced during childhood. Another example of how life experience gets embedded into our biology. This shows you from a national study of British subjects in England that heart disease and death by MI, or heart attack, increases as the cholesterol levels increase within each person, but more importantly, by social class, going from the dark boxes, which are the lowest income workers, to the palest or whitest boxes, which are the administrative or executive office holders, you can see that even among those with high levels of cholesterol, their incidence of heart disease and death by heart attack is lower than it is in the least advantaged populations. Racism, independent of wealth and income, is a stress that takes a toll on our health and development. In fact, we know that if you even control for income, you find that Black Americans suffer poorer health outcomes than do white Americans by and large. In fact, African American executives, doctors, lawyers, corporate leaders, have higher incidences of death during the first year of their children's lives than do poor white high school dropouts. Let's take a closer look at some of these influences. I've made a lifelong study of death during the first year of life and all causes of mortality from the first year. If you look, you can see that African American infants die twice as frequently as white infants during the first year of life. And that hasn't changed over decades, even though the health of both whites and blacks has improved. So what's accounting for all of this? Well, again, is it genetics? A colleague, former student of mine, Dr. James Collins, has done some of the best work on racial disparities and health outcomes between blacks and whites, and finds that, in fact, African-born blacks are much closer to white American babies with respect to their pregnancy outcomes than are US-born blacks, who suffer much more difficult outcomes and early life experiences of health. How about the way mothers behave during pregnancy? Well, smoking is a good, easy example. Turns out that white women smoke during pregnancy more than do black women. But even among black non-smokers, the incidence of problems, health problems among their babies is much higher than among white women who smoke. How about access to health care during pregnancy? Well, in fact, by and large, African Americans go to the obstetrician during the first trimester much more regularly than do white Americans. And yet, even among African American women who access health care in the first trimester of pregnancy, their incidence of infant health problems and death far exceeds those among white Americans who access prenatal care only after the first trimester. Well, is it income and wealth? Again, as I mentioned before, here's the evidence that African Americans who have graduate level education still lose their babies far more frequently than do white high school dropouts. Shameful. Well, what about that stress that we began with? And there lies some of the clues. In fact, as Rebecca mentioned, cortisol and some of the other stress-reacting hormones and chemicals that the brain secretes in response to challenging situations. There's a difference between blacks and whites and birth outcomes with respect to the secretion of these stress hormones during pregnancy. And already by the 20th week of pregnancy, halfway through a full-term pregnancy, you can see that those women who are going to deliver prematurely also secrete much higher levels of stress hormones than do women who are going to go on to have full-term babies. Here's another really powerful example that can serve many, explain many reasons for poor outcomes for children during the first year of life. This compares infants in Sweden with infants in Great Britain, England. And England, by the way, looks exactly like the United States does with respect to their data about infant mortality, childhood health problems, and death rates. You can see in red those boxes. As the social class of the British families becomes more advantaged, the incidence of problems, health problems for their children, their babies, decreases. Whereas in Sweden, there's absolutely no difference between health outcomes and wealth outcomes among the citizens of Sweden. In other words, the poorest workers in Sweden have better outcomes for their children's health and development than do the wealthiest people in the United States or Great Britain. And that's because income inequality, as I've been depicting, is one source that creates it within a person an unequal sense of worth, of effectiveness, of what I can accomplish, of how much people respect me. And that's learned early in life. And income matters less in communities or countries where there is more universal access to healthcare, to education, to childcare, to transportation, to safe workplaces, secure neighborhoods, etc. The biology of all this is that low self-esteem, self-control, sense of self-purpose, all together cause a cascade of brain chemicals that destroy actual cells in the brain that account for our ability to fight infection, inflammation, and create an all-cause mortality risk, demonstrating that mental health is the root of physical health, and that therefore the social health of society affects the mental health of the family. In other words, healthcare accounts for just about 10% and only 10% of human health. The rest is really how we live, how we feel. And it's never too early or too late to do something in support of a young child. It only gets more difficult and costlier as the child ages. Development is therefore all about nature and all about nurture. And the emotional life of the child sets the course for health, learning, and happiness. I want to leave you with something to think about. Because by the time a child reaches his or her first birthday, they need to feel 3 ways: valued, connected, and that they make a difference. And when they do, you know that they're going to have success, happiness, and even better health. So by age 1, have a child show you I matter, I belong, and I can on your own. Thank you.
And thank you, Peter. That was a dense education in a very short time. And you too, Rebecca. We learned so much from both of you. It was really a rich education for all of us. Have you any comment or question that you would like to pose, Rebecca?
Well, you know, I was so struck by the powerful, powerful data shared by Peter. And I did have a couple of questions, but first I wanted to kind of ask, you know, you kind of really talked eloquently about this balanced scale of life experiences, of risk factors balanced with, you know, health and wellness factors. And I'm kind of wondering, you know, what are some interventions or investments that you think really would shift the balance scale, in the direction of health and wellness for children and families?
Well, thank you for asking that, Rebecca. And that can be answered at the personal level of the family, the parent, and it needs to also be answered at the level of the policies that we create as a nation that enable parents to have opportunity through education, through other child care supports, through community health, socially and environmentally. These are all interventions that wealthy communities take for granted. Poor communities suffer deprivation.
Yeah.
There is absolutely no reason, as other countries have demonstrated, there can be differences in wealth, but we can make up for the bad impact of stress by ensuring that some of these basic human child rights are attended to. And by the way, so I would say that even though everybody thinks about the basic needs of shelter, food, right, healthy nutrition, but education, freedom to play, freedom from discrimination, inclusion, all of those are equally important in order to ensure healthy growth and development.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Well, Rebecca, I wonder, we haven't talked about it at all, but could you mention the value of play and its meaning in the life of the very young child?
Yeah, I think we often say at 0 to 3 that play is the work of childhood, right? I think it's a common phrase for us in the early education field, but that is really how young children discover how the world works. They, put on mom's shoes and pick up a pocketbook and, plastic toy keys, and they take the perspective of their parent, right? So they're practicing empathy. They're imagining someone else's point of view. As children are constructing with blocks, they're building spatial analysis and the foundation of algebra. So, this is really how children are discovering the world around them. And I think, to Peter's point, we really need to fiercely guard and preserve that free play, because there is such a push now to bring, academics into early childhood. But the truth is that, with well-designed and thoughtfully designed play experiences, children are learning as much or more than they would through, a curriculum.
Yes, it's a really important point. Peter?
Yeah, I would only add to that through play, a child learns how does somebody respond to me? And how can I handle and overcome a challenge that I am presented with in this play situation? And so I learned from that. And by the way, toys don't have to come in fancy boxes out of toy stores, right? A stick is a remarkable toy in the hands of a young child. So is a little animal. We take for granted that we don't appreciate the small things, but a child does. And that's what we lose as we become adults, that appreciation for the wonder in life that comes in very, very small packages.
We had a comment on the chat from someone who said, shouldn't this be taught in high school? Shouldn't there be something in the curriculum? What's your feeling about this, Rebecca?
Well, it's interesting. There's a program, I think it started in England, but it's a program where they actually ask for community volunteers for someone who's recently had a baby. And the community volunteer brings their newborn into a classroom. And I think it starts at 5th grade and goes all the way up to 12th grade. But they bring a newborn in and they come in every month across the baby's life while the children are in school. And they talk about what the baby's doing that month, what the baby's learning. And it really becomes exactly what the questioner suggested. It becomes kind of a family life class where children get a window into what it's like to be a parent and what real babies look like and act like. So I think it's a phenomenal opportunity for us to really nurture a sense of what parenting is and what children need.
Rachel, I've actually seen and read about a number of schools in this country where there is sort of like a big brother, big sister system that is organized between upper class high schoolers and elementary school children, such that even at school assemblies, the young kids sit on the lap of the older children. And both of them warm up and benefit from each other.
What a nice idea that is. I think we have time for one more question. Someone asked, should Spanish-speaking children be taught in Spanish for a time before English? Or should they be taught in English right away? Should they be read stories in Spanish? Rebecca, I had noticed that you did some work on dual language. I wonder if you wanted to field this one.
Sure. I mean, I very briefly, I'm sensitive to time, but what we know is that many children are born into a bilingual family or a multilingual family. And children can, from birth, develop dual or tri or even more language systems just through everyday exposure. The real key to support that bilingualism, though, is equivalent input of language in both of their home languages. And we say equivalent input 50-50, 40-60, but we want them to be hearing the same quality of language in both of their languages so that they really truly become deeply bilingual. And so as children begin to enter childcare settings or early education settings, often these are English only settings, either by design or by coincidence. And as a result, that balance gets a little bit out of whack. And we begin to kind of put a child at risk for losing the gift of bilingualism, which in our global community is a tremendous opportunity for young children. And the research, at least for preschool, shows that children who are bilingual tend to perform better when they have two teachers in the classroom, one of whom speaks their home language. So there is some emerging evidence as well.
Yeah, there's also evidence that very young children, as young as 2 years old, do not confuse languages. Have flexible brains so that they can give a message from father to mother in his language and then report to the mother in her language the exact same message. It's beautiful to see that.
That's amazing. That is amazing. Again, our thanks to you both for this excellent start to our understanding of the importance of the early years. It was truly a wonderful experience. Now let's turn the program back to Allison Lauer and the Florida Kiwanis Foundation.
Well, good evening. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Rachel, Rebecca, Dr. Peter. It was such a pleasure to hear you all speak tonight. Before we leave, we want to remind and thank all of our listeners of the special screening of No Small Matter. It's going to be available for the next 3 days, July 1st through the 3rd. And that's going to come over digitally with a link and a password tomorrow morning for you all to enjoy. So thank you again. Thank you for celebrating the 50th anniversary tonight with us. And we look forward to seeing you next week at 7 p.m. on Wednesday for our next webinar. Thank you all and have a great night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.